I didn't plan on making this video. It was only when I began work on this project that I realized just how many videos there were on Scout Trooper helmets and how to make them, that the idea of making my own video felt discouraging. I didn't feel as though I had anything new to offer, or a way to differentiate mine from theirs. But I had a realization. There are hardly any videos out there showcasing a realistically weathered Scout Trooper helmet. Thus the idea for this video was reborn. I haven't yet talked about weathering on this channel, so I figured this video is the perfect chance to do so. Not only am I going to show you guys the build process of printing, post-processing, painting, decal construction, and placement, but I'm also going to show you some really cool weathering techniques that can be used on any project. So without further ado, let's start at the beginning. Using the files provided by Dio3D, I printed the helmet in multiple parts on my Bamboo Lab P1P. True to the films, the helmet features a flip-top design, but that's not something we're going to need to worry about until the very end. What we do need to worry about is removing the layer lines and making the surface as smooth as possible. Removing the layer lines on this helmet proved to be challenging, due to some of the hard-to-reach areas, primarily underneath the visor. Because it was still the dead of winter and really cold outside during this phase of the build, I was lazy, and wanted to spend as little time as possible outside in my shed where my paint booth is set up. I decided to do most of the filling indoors, using large amounts of wood filler, only going outside to quickly spray coats of Duplicolor filler primer instead. This was the process that I repeated over and over again. Because sanding is so mind-numbingly boring, I decided to do something new on this project that I've never done before. I kept a logbook near my sanding area and logged all of the time I spent sanding the helmet. In total, it took me just over 5 hours to get this helmet smooth and ready for paint. Honestly, I have no idea what to do with this information or what it even means. Because it's my first time logging the hours spent sanding, I don't have anything to compare it to. I'm going to be doing this for all my projects moving forward, that way one day I'll have some type of average to have as a reference. Knowing I was going to weather this helmet from the beginning was a very freeing feeling when it came time to paint. It was important that the base coat was black, that way when I added scratches to the white paint later on, they would be more visible and eye-catching. The white paint I used honestly kinda sucked. You can see immediately how chunky and runny it was, despite the fact that it was brand new and shaken well. The quality of this paint really would have been an issue if I didn't plan to weather the helmet. I always find myself struggling with two types of spray paint, gloss black and white, any variety of white for that matter. If you guys have any recommendations for an alternative brand or method of laying down white paint, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Luckily in my case, imperfections were welcome for this project. After giving the helmet a full day to dry, I needed to paint the detail areas. In order to make this as easy on myself as possible, I used an airbrush whenever possible. Luckily, there were only a few things that had to be hand painted, which I used airbrush paints for due to the fact that they're very thin and hardly leave any brush strokes. There were two decals for this helmet which had to be made. One on the cheek and the other on the forehead. Unfortunately, the Dio3D files don't provide any templates or information on the decals themselves, so I was left to my own devices to figure it out. I started by downloading clear reference images of the decals themselves. The hard part was figuring out how big they actually needed to be. During my search, I came across a 501st forum where an individual provided the dimensions for both decals. I'm gonna include a printable template for the decals in the description, that way if you want to make your own you can simply just download them and not have to go through the trouble of sizing them like I had to do. In order to make the decals, I'm gonna be using my Cricut machine. In case you're unaware what this machine does, it's primarily a cutting machine, but has a wide variety of other capabilities depending on which model you have. I'm using the Explorer Air 3, and I primarily use mine for making vinyl decals, stencils, and stickers here and there. If you don't own a Cricut machine, I suppose you could print the template of the decals and trace them onto something thin like tracing paper, then carefully use an X-Acto knife to cut out the images, turning the paper into a stencil, which you can then use to paint the decals onto the helmet. In my case, I'm using permanent gray vinyl and placing them onto the helmet to the best of my ability using transfer tape. Now, to be completely honest with you, it is possible that these aren't placed properly. It's possible that the dimensions aren't perfect. Maybe they're too small, maybe they're too big. In truth, I don't really care. To my eye, they look fine. Besides, most of the props used in the original trilogy were all flawed and unique in their own way, so why should mine be any different? What matters most to me is that it looks close enough. In my opinion, this helmet looked way too plain and boring when in pristine condition, so now, this is where the fun begins as we begin the weathering process. The first thing I did was use this variety pack of small files and began adding scratches to any sharp edges and random areas all over the helmet. I really took my time during this stage. I probably spent over an hour doing this. The key here is to be as random and asymmetrical as possible, adding light, medium, and heavy scratches from all different directions, being sure to use different types of files every so often. The next thing I did was mix together a black and brown acrylic wash. I like my washes to be watered down significantly. This mix was primarily brown with a little bit of black. When applying the wash, the goal is to allow the paint to settle in all the recesses and details, any place where dirt would naturally settle over time. Using a microfiber towel, you have a lot of control on how you want the finish to look. A damp towel will remove more of the wash, a dry towel will do the opposite and preserve it. Wiping off the wash will remove most of it, however using a gentle dabbing motion will leave a stippling effect, preserving most of the wash, resulting in a realistic looking dirt buildup. I wanted the high points, such as the very top of the helmet, to be dirty, so it was those areas where I used a dabbing motion to preserve as much of the wash as possible. The benefit of having your wash really thin is the ability to slowly build up weathering over time, giving you more control of how much or how little dirt buildup you want. I did a few passes of this wash until I was happy with the result. I've recently been experimenting with a weathering technique which can give you a wide variety of realistic dirt effects. That method involves the use of pastel chalks and matte Mod Podge. If you crush the chalk into a powder, you can mix the two together to achieve a realistic dirt buildup. There's a few ways you can use this technique, each way resulting in a different type of finish. The first is to simply mix the powdered chalk directly with the Mod Podge as mentioned moments ago. Doing so will result in a thicker, textured buildup of dirt. However, if you water down the Mod Podge with water, then mix it with chalk, the result is a very clean, even, and more controllable dirt-like effect. Lastly, my favorite way of using chalk is to simply apply it using a brush without any Mod Podge. It goes on as a very light dust which looks both subtle and convincing. I used a combination of all three of these techniques, making sure to add chalk into all the crevices and places where dirt would naturally build up. Similar to how we used a microfiber towel before, you can once again use that to remove or tone down the chalk however you see fit. I spent a lot of time doing this, adding small amounts of dirt buildup, removing it, then re-adding it until satisfied. I wanted to go one step further and add some dirt spatter to the helmet. My vision for this helmet was that it was worn by a trooper in a forest-like area with wet and muddy terrain, so it made sense that there would be some kind of dirt spatter from down below. Using the same black and brown wash from earlier, I positioned myself below the helmet and flicked paint off the brush up and onto the helmet. I repeated this process a few times. Since we're using water-based paints, it's very easy to remove and try again until you're happy with it. I added spatter all around the helmet, making sure not to go too crazy with it, removing what I felt was too much. With the helmet weathered, The final thing to do is install the visor. I'm using a dark green tinted face shield that I purchased off Amazon. Included in the STL files is a visor cutout template. I traced the shape of the visor onto the face shield, then used scissors to cut most of it. I did have to switch to a Dremel with a cutting wheel attachment in order to complete the cut. The visor was then inserted and secured using hot glue. I'm glad I decided to follow through by finishing this build and making this video. Admittedly, my motivation for completing this project was wavering at the beginning. I planned on making a pristine helmet, which I very quickly realized was bland and uninspiring. The thing I realized more and more about 3D printing is that there's a never-ending list of new things to make and an ever-decreasing amount of time to do so. It's often hard for me to prioritize my projects, with new and more exciting ones often taking over, leaving some ideas behind, with this build almost being one of them. The idea of weathering this helmet was more than enough spark for me to see it through. I hope you enjoyed the video, and more importantly, I hope you learned something new that you can apply to your own builds. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. For those of you that are Star Wars fans, I promise you, you are not going to want to miss my next video. I can't wait to show you guys what I've been working on. So I'll see you guys soon once that's finished. Until then, take care, and thanks for watching.